today we're going to talk about scaling. And I'm really delighted to be joined by Sophie Mather, a scaling expert, founder of Biovation, former advisory council member to the Climate Solutions portfolio. Sophie also plays a key role in assessing solutions for the Earthshot Prize, which is one of the world's most ambitious platforms for climate innovation. Thank you for joining us today, Sophie.
Thank you very much for the invite, Pauline. Really looking forward to our conversation.
Sophie, you have a bit of an anecdote and a kind of a personal experience with the topic of coal phase out. So could you start us off there?
Yeah, definitely. I suppose I bring a lived experience into this, and I think that's why I've got such a drive for supporting it. I was living and working in Hong Kong in the early 2000s, and at a time industrial pollution was extremely visible. It hung in the air like a thick smog, and this was even more obvious when the factories actually closed in southern China for things like Chinese New Year and Golden Week, when for a week at a time we would have blue skies. And I think that was a real kind of pivotal point for me, because I realized how bad the pollution was. I was living it, and I believed that because of the role that I played in the industry, I could actually be part of that change as well. So I think I'm really lucky in a sense that I have seen it and lived it, so I understand how important it is. Whereas I think some people working in this area maybe are driven more from metrics or legislation, and maybe don't see exactly the day-to-day impact of what it's having to the environment and the people that are living in it. So yeah, I feel very strong drive to this work.
And I think it's also an important reminder that when we're talking about coal phase out or electrification, it's not just about the long-term benefit for the world's climate goals, but there's actual kind of immediate benefits that happen for people who work in the factories and who live around them, for the daily kind of particulate pollution that those fuels generate.
When I was living in Hong Kong, people would be checking the pollution index. So that is how it would change from day to day. And as I say, when the factories were operating or when they were closed, there was a distinct difference. So it very much does impact the people working and living in those environments very, very acutely.
Absolutely. And that's why, moving as quickly as possible on the topic of electrification is really important. I'd like to hear from you, how you evaluate an innovator from a kind of commitment and leadership perspective. If we look at the landscape today, not everything is kind of in place for a solution to scale, and a lot of it's outside of their control. So it's kind of a leap of faith to create something that a sector is going to need in a couple of years' time, and depends on some of these external circumstances. How do you kind of evaluate the ability of an organization to go from idea to deployment when that pathway is quite long term and maybe even uncertain?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think first and foremost, I work within the framework of the organisation that I'm assessing on the behalf of. So it's really important for that organisation to have a roadmap or, scope for the assessors to work against. So we're working in an aligned manner. But I think personally, there's some key elements that I'm looking for. I'm looking for management and leadership. How engaged are the management team? And quite often the applications maybe are coming from middle management, but really checking in that the leadership is invested in this. And, what's important for them is going to be a key trigger to the long-term success of this. So what's driving them? And also how much management putting in themselves? Is there an investment element from their side? Because I think the applicants that I see where there is an element of management investment, whether that's time, infrastructure, or actual fiscal budgets, they're far more invested in the overall outcome than if they were just to say, okay, we're only going to go with budget from funding applications or government grants or whatever. So I'm really looking for that kind of that balance of where the support is coming from and really the mindset that management have. I'm also looking for identification of challenges, and sometimes I feel like I'm always looking for problems, but it's the problems and the challenges that really I get a lot of value from when I'm looking at assessments and when I'm looking at innovations coming forwards. I would say about 95% of the applicants that I look at in assessments put funding or money is their biggest challenge.
Right.
Now, I like to question that, because if they had all the money in the world, there's still going to be some roadblocks, there's still going to be some challenges. So I'm always trying to get beyond the funding challenge and really look at things like infrastructure. What are the immovable challenges? It could be things like legislation, interconnected infrastructure, government restrictions, etc. If those are listed as challenges, then that is far more important in the assessment than purely just money. Because, if, for example, you were to give a grant to an organization and they have got some of those more immovable challenges, then that money is not going to create the impact that the investor or the funder is actually looking for. So those are the things that I kind of get quite obsessed with when I'm looking at applications. And I think when an applicant can actually talk about those and how they're going to navigate them is really important.
So I guess it's kind of a combination of actually seeing the challenges that are going to come their way and being prepared to address those, because as you pointed out, they won't just be funding. And when we look at electrification, it will not just be funding. It will be availability of renewable electricity at a certain price, infrastructure, all of the things you just mentioned. But it's also transparency. So not only kind of having identified what they are, but transparently communicating them so that, as a reviewer of an application for funding or as an investor trying to make an investment, you understand that the solution is not only aware, but very open about what their future challenges might be, which will ultimately impact their ability to scale and get your return on investment or make sure that grant funding has been used correctly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's some hesitation or nervousness with regards to people putting applications in. They think if they list all the problems, they will be seen as very negative or not worthy of that funding. But actually what you're doing by being very open about it is you're building trust with the organization that's likely going to fund you. And I think building that trust as early on in the relationship as possible is going to be really beneficial for the ultimate outcome of the work. And it shows, how you're wanting to kind of work together. And I think, challenges as big as electrification really demand the need for collaboration as much as possible, which kind of leads me on to my next point, which is network and collaboration. I'm looking for how an applicant is actually connected and what their networks look like. And I'm really curious to know not necessarily the people or the organizations, but what skill sets are actually missing in those relationships. Because I wouldn't expect any applicant to have all the skill sets that are required, but having them identify what skill sets that are needing, then, as they, move forwards to get funding, you can work again as part of a team to make sure that those skill sets are coming into the remit of the work.
Super interesting. And if we think about the textile sector specifically, then I imagine you're also looking for that kind of connection to industry. Have you spoken to textile manufacturers about whether this solution is relevant for them or how it should be made relevant for them? Is that something that maybe you could expand a bit upon?
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily just the textile sector. I think for something as big as this, and we've seen this in the electrification work that we've been doing, I've actually been able to bring people in from other industries into this space. And I think that becomes more and more important. It's not just the textile industry that is looking to electrify manufacturing. A lot of industries are doing the same. So when we're talking about those networks, it's leveraging across regions, geographies, and also industries that are going to be the key part in this.
So you've spoken a bit about, having the foresight for what the challenges might be, being transparent about that, the importance of collaboration and linking into the industries or the industry that you're ultimately looking to scale in. This requires a lot of strategic planning and thinking. How do you evaluate or maybe even support an organization that has to do that, very long-term and complicated planning to get from whatever maturity stage they are to becoming a scaled solution?
Yeah. I suppose I've always worked in that very strategic space, always working 5-10 years ahead of kind of mainstream activity. And I really like in an application to try and work out how their Gantt or their project management process is actually going to work. and work with regards to all the different stages of the work that are actually required. I mean, we've spoken about some of them today, building networks, cutting across industries, all sorts of different elements are actually required in this. I'm looking for a very clear vision, but also with, a clear output and also the milestones in that journey. Because in something as big as this, you need to be able to map it across, as you say, a long period of time from, initial funding to outputs. And things that I will always be wanting to see is how does a risk assessment actually work into that planning? Innovation, I would love to say it's plain sailing. I think the reason I like it is there's a lot of bumps in the road. There's a lot of roadblocks, and we've spoken about challenges and risks. That is a key part of this. So how does the risk assessment work into the very long-term plan and the contingent that's in place for managing that? I'm also looking for the big potential derailers. So associated with risk there, what are the really big things that could potentially floor this work? And I think extra emphasis needs to be played on those and contingent put into the strategic planning. And I think a lot of opportunities come from that. If you can expect that, then your project will work a lot better. Levers to optimize the work. Again, in the strategic planning, is there any key industry events or new bits of legislation, other piece of funding that can be worked into it? These are all very, very strategic elements that will actually support an application and make that funding by the organisation that's assessing go that much further. Then there's also that element of the realism to be reactive. In innovation, you need to work quite quickly, but you also need to have the infrastructure to assess how things are going and pivot when needed. And I think as long as you've got that strategically planned in, then it doesn't come a surprise to either the project team or the people that are funding the work. And finally, just making sure that there's enough time strategically. I think innovators and entrepreneurs naturally are quite renowned for being overly optimistic. I'm definitely one of those people. And I think just taking some breathing space as you're putting together that strategic plan to make sure that enough time is actually factored in. This is bold work that is being undertaken. We have worked with coal power for hundreds of years. Shifting to electrification is going to take time, and I think factoring that in to the strategic plan is really, really important.
So I guess there has to be optimism there and drive from the leadership and skin in the game, as you mentioned earlier on, to believe in the solution, but that has to be matched with an equal weight of risk assessment, flexibility, ability to pivot, connection to industry, and all of these other things you've mentioned. It's not just the kind of will and the enthusiasm, which it seems is kind of that's what you see on the outside in the venture capital or solution scaling world. But actually the behind the scenes is really the nitty gritty and this, really assessing the risks, what could derail and maybe a less optimistic picture than what you see on the outside, but you need that realism to actually be able to make it through to that end goal of scale.
Realism is important, but I think realism, it's exciting actually working in that space. I suppose, finding the people that find it exciting is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super interesting. And if you kind of think of the textile sector as a unique specimen, let's say, but you also evaluate solutions across sectors in the Earthshot Prize, for example. What do you think are some of the similarities between the textile sector and other sectors, and what are some things that you think innovators looking to scale in the textile sector could improve from or learn from other sectors?
Yeah, this is an interesting one for me. I think coming into this, from the Earthshot position where it's very big picture, holistic across sectors and everything, I get a very good view of who's doing what. And I think one thing is quite key is we all think the other industry's doing it better. I think we're all facing the same problems and have the same opportunities as well. But I think when we split it out and we look at the textile industry as opposed to other industries, the textile industry is an old industry. Most of the infrastructure and the process, how we process textiles is very much built on kind of early industrial revolution processes. So that's a blessing, as in the industry understands very well the processes in place, but it can also be a curse because it's quite hard to change something that is so very much ingrained, and the infrastructure of manufacturing is massive now based on pretty much the same process model. Also, consumerism is kind of outpacing progress in a way in the clothing industry. But however, saying that, I think you'll find that across most industries. So there's a lot of things there in the textile industry. But then I think if we look across other industries, I think where we can actually benefit and take some leverage is some of the system change approaches that can be designed from the kind of the get-go, from the root cause issues. And not having to retrofit something into an old process. So I think that's something that I'm seeing that is really quite interesting. And then I think from my personal perspective is not being afraid to branch out and put yourself in the center of a different industry conversation. And I think this is what I really get huge value from the Earthshot work is, I have spent the core of my career in the textile industry, and we have similar conversations with similar people quite a lot of the time. Once you take a little bit of a different approach and center yourself in a different conversation with different people, different learnings come through, different connections. And I think that is really valuable. And I suppose, in this work here, if there was one call to action for people as they're kind of listening in, it would be to put yourself in a place of maybe slight discomfort, into a different industry for a little bit and see what those conversations bring forwards, because I think there'll be a huge amount of learnings that we can leverage from to take into topics such as the electrification.
That's some great advice, which we do plan to take, because even on the electrification topic, there are industries quite similar to ours. Food and beverage processing, paper processing, they have sort of similar temperature needs to us, and they're already doing a lot of work in other geographies as well. So building those connections between the industries, I think, will really help us to learn from work that's already happening. And I think, given that the electrification topic is it is not textile specific, a heat pump can be installed in several industries. For us to move into the innovator mindset of energy delivery only will be really interesting. And I think to round off what you mentioned in terms of the sector being quite similar to how it's been for, a very long time, a lot of the electrification discussion is not. It's, heat pumps, for example, are not a plug and play solution. They completely change how energy is stored and delivered around a factory. So for this new solution, we do have to take a different systems approach. And I think that is an opportunity for us to rethink how we do things and how we have been doing them for a very long time, which is in equal parts exciting. But as you also mentioned, that does make it a little bit more challenging because we are rooted in our ways of working.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you so much, Sophie. This has been some really great advice for anyone looking to scale in this industry, be that in electrification or other processing technology. And thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Well, thank you very much for the invite. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, Pauline.